We do know a fair amount given the interviews he sat for, the op-eds he's penned, the book he has written. I mean, Carol Leonnig, what is the question that you would, I mean, what are your not leading questions, but what are your top of mind questions for the vice president, you know, if you were an investigator with the DOJ?
You're right. So right, Alex, that so much of what Pence experienced that day has been reported in the pages of my newspaper, in various books. But to me, it seems really critical that the special counsel, Jack Smith, wants Pence in an interview room to get more deeply into what the president said to him, what the president said, what words they exchanged. And that goes to ultimately former President Donald Trump's state of mind as he was pulling all of these different levers, increasingly desperately trying to hold on to power, trying to block and overturn the election results. For example, I'd want to ask Pence, well, what did Donald Trump say to you about losing the election? What did he say in terms of acknowledging whether or not he thought he had lost? I'd also get at, Vice President Pence, do you remember what the president said to you about his strategy for holding on to power? What did he say about the electors? What did he say to you about whether or not he believed the claim that was given that Pence would have this incredible power to basically reject the certification of the vote, which actually, you know, as you know, and I know Barbara knows, the lawyer who proposed that to Donald Trump would later acknowledge there was no way that that would work, and he didn't even think it was feasible.
Barb, let's follow on what Carol is saying in terms of the state of mind. How does that factor into the potential charges here? What are the potential legal repercussions if they can establish a certain state of mind vis-a-vis the president and his intentionality in terms of inciting an insurrection?
Well, I have always thought, Alex, that the best charge available here is not so much inciting the insurrection, which I think has some challenges under the First Amendment, but instead the charge of conspiracy to defraud the United States. That is, I knew I lost this election and I tried to steal it back anyway. And Mike Pence is a critical component of that because it was trying to persuade Mike Pence publicly, privately, on Twitter and at the rally to thwart the counting of the votes, to abuse his power. And so I think all of those questions that Carol just said go to Donald Trump's knowledge of fraud and intent to persuade Mike Pence to abuse his power. And so if that can be proven, you need not even prove that Donald Trump incited the insurrection. I think that's going to stand or fall based on some of the facts that are already known. I think the committee did something really interesting with regard to that theory, which was it's not so much the speech at the ellipse, but the failure to do anything for 3 hours, and then making the tweet that says Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what was necessary, and we demand answers, which threw fuel on the fire and renewed the vigor of the protesters and caused them to start chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." And so I think the things that Donald Trump said to Mike Pence that could reveal whether he knew he had actually lost the election and that what he was doing was an improper effort to retain office. And there were conversations that aides could provide some detail on, but there are also conversations where Mike Pence was alone with Donald Trump. And that's why I think it is critically important that they hear directly from Mike Pence about those conversations.
Just to follow on that, because this is the import of this testimony is so significant, what can Trump do to stop Pence? I mean, there's conflicting reports about whether this is being set up for a fight over executive privilege. Do you think that that is the case? I mean, what levers are there for Trump at this point to prevent Pence from divulging the secrets that he has fought so hard to keep undisclosed?
I think Donald Trump will assert executive privilege and try to stop this, and I think he will fail. This is a grand jury subpoena, which is a little different from some of the January 6th subpoenas that we saw. It's supposed to be secret. We know about it because there's a report about it, sourced to people familiar with the matter. But the witness himself is permitted to disclose grand jury material. So Mike Pence could, in good conscience, I think, say that there's a potential executive privilege issue here. I am sharing it with the former president in case he wants to assert a privilege. I think Donald Trump will assert a privilege. But I think under the precedent of United States versus Nixon, where the Supreme Court said that the grand jury is entitled to everyone's evidence, and that in certain situations, although there is executive privilege, it must yield when there is an interest of paramount importance. And courts have already held that with regard to the January 6th investigation when it came to White House documents that were subpoenaed from the National Archives. I expect that same result here. So I think Trump will try, and I think he will fail.
Carol, at the risk of reading too much into the president's prolific use of social media, he has spent a long time, as you're well aware, vilifying Mike Pence, calling him all manner of names. But recently, within, I think, the last several weeks, he sent out a conciliatory kind of message about Mike Pence vis-a-vis the classified documents that were found at Mike Pence's residence, and effectively said, leave Mike Pence alone, he's a good man. Now, anytime the former president decides to play nice with someone he has spent almost a career making fun of, otherwise chastising or diminishing, I think it's worth trying to understand why. And I wonder if at all you think that could be a preemptive move to potentially curry favor with Mike Pence ahead of what could be fairly damaging testimony that Mike Pence might make to a grand jury. I know that's a lot of ifs. I know that's a lot of suppositions, but I just wonder if you think that there's any chance in this scenario that Mike Pence is entreated by any of the words of Donald Trump.
Okay, those are three great questions built in there, Alex, and I'll try to take them quickly. Let's go backwards. Mike Pence, I don't think is going to be influenced by anything Donald Trump says at this point. I mean, I reported on what Pence's day was like at the Capitol on January 6th, huddling with his wife, his daughter, her husband, his aides, in a basement, trying to stay safe, but also trying to remain in the Capitol so that he could finish the job that Donald Trump didn't want him to do. He's pretty much broken a relationship with Donald Trump because he believed Donald Trump put him and his family in such grave danger. For what reason is obvious. Second, you asked, is it possible Pence is trying, Trump is trying to win over Pence? It's always possible. But I think your first theory has a little more strength, which is Donald Trump is worried about his classified records exposure right now. This is a case that is probably causing the former president the most sleepless nights because it's the easiest case to establish that he was engaged in potential obstruction of a subpoena seeking classified records. Remember, his team asserted to the Department of Justice that they'd done a diligent search and all the records had been returned, and then the FBI agents come in at the Department of Justice's behest, and lo and behold, they find a bunch more classified records. So I think Donald Trump, who's often focused on Donald Trump, is mostly excited to say, look, Pence had them too. He's a good guy. He didn't do anything wrong. Same here.
Silly me. I thought it could be a long con for the January 6th investigations. But of course, I think you're right, Carol. It's the most obvious answer, which is he's just trying to mitigate potential damage from the potentially looming criminal indictment at his front door down in Mar-a-Lago.